Well, joining us now from Washington is John Hanna of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who also served as Vice President Dick Cheney's National Security Advisor. John, you were at the White House during 9/11. Well, what do you think of the next steps the administration should take?
Well, thanks for having me, Pat. Listen, this is a big gamble by the president, potentially big payoffs. He took really the greatest terrorist mastermind in the world off the battlefield. Soleimani will be very, very difficult to replace for the Iranians. It's a terrible blow for that system and their entire national security policy. I also think that it could reassert U.S. deterrence in the Middle East. It is a tremendous shock to the Iranian system. They thought Soleimani was untouchable. There has been escalation with Iran for the past 40 years, but over the past 6 months, it's become particularly acute with attacks in the Gulf on shipping, the shoot down of a U.S. drone, the attacks on the Saudi oil facilities in September. These were all met with a minimal U.S. response, real U.S. restraint. But now with the attacks on our contractor in Iraq that resulted in his death, as well as then the attack on our embassy in an attempt to humiliate the United States, the President of the United States said enough is enough, and he went just not one rung up the escalation ladder. He went several up at killing really the second most important person in that regime, something that I think the Iranians never expected. My guess is that they're terribly unsettled right now. They don't know exactly what to do and what this president is capable of if they, again, accidentally cross one of his red lines that could bring the full wrath of American military power against Iran itself in a way that would threaten the survival of that regime, which is of course, their highest order priority. So I think right now, the United States has got to batten down the hatches, prepare for the worst, obviously, but continue to make very, very clear to Iran that while we've got things that we need to worry about here, they've got much more to worry about if they continue to push and prod and threaten Americans and American interests in the Middle East and around the world.
John, the president said we're not calling for regime change, but actually regime change is what the people of Iran want. They don't like the mullahs. That theocracy that's in place is dictatorial, and they really are laboring under the goad of their leaders. Shouldn't we go for a regime change in Iran?
Well, I think if we have had the instruments to do it, I think that's the obvious outcome. That's the way you actually settle this 40-year war between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran, is that you get rid of this regime and have a regime that actually will allow the Iranian people and Iranian culture and civilization to thrive. It's an incredibly old and talented culture and civilization. Iranians thrive anywhere around the world except in Iran itself. That's, of course, the great tragedy because of this totalitarian Islamist regime that they toil under. I do think the United States has to do much more to support human rights, not only in Iran, but in Iraq as well, and Lebanon. These are Iran's two great imperial outposts where since October, we've also seen massive demonstrations against a corrupt pro-Iranian political class. We've seen Iranian consulates burned down in Iraq. And then, of course, in November, we saw perhaps one of the greatest uprisings inside of Iran itself against this regime since the 1979 revolution, where they had to kill almost 1,500 people in a matter of days or even just a week, something the Iranians have never had to do before. They're under huge pressure as a result of American sanctions. So this strike against Soleimani, something they didn't see coming, that has really thrown them off balance, couldn't come at a worse time for the Iranian republic because its legitimacy of this regime has never been more in question from the Iranian people themselves.
You know, John, if we put sanctions on Iran and we bomb their, say, Harg Island, for example, of all those refineries there, that hurts the Iranian people, though. Is he going to? I mean, how do you get to the regime, the leadership, without hurting the people who really want to get rid of them?
There's no question that this has got to be an important prong of American foreign policy. Even as we're bearing down on this regime, Pat, we've got to have humanitarian exceptions in Treasury Department licensing that allows critical medicines and food to get into the Iranian people. At the same time, you've got to say that these are the most effective crushing and punishing sanctions the Americans have ever imposed on Iran. And yet, as we saw in November, the Iranian people are not blaming the United States for their horrible situation. They know that the cause of their misery and their pain and their suffering is this Islamist regime in Iran that has so brutally ruled over them for 40 years, that has completely mismanaged that economy and spent the wealth of the Iranian people not on advancing Iran's own, their own well-being, but on these wreaking death and destruction and havoc across the Middle East against not only Americans, but against Israelis. And of course, Arabs themselves have been one of the greatest victims, particularly since the genocide in Syria, which no one was more responsible for than Qasem Soleimani.
John, about the sanctions, though, Pelosi is saying, well, the president is exceeding his authority. We need to, put congressional strictures on him. Is what they're doing is that wise, or is it even constitutional?
Well, listen, Pat, I'm one of those people who believe when the American Congress and executive branch operate in coordination in a bipartisan fashion, whether domestically or particularly internationally, America is absolutely at its strongest. So I think the president needs to do his best after he's taken this kind of action and given the risks that we're facing to, as frustrating, as difficult as it can be, to actually reach out to Congress and try and inform people about what his strategy is going forward, how he's going to actually protect Americans from the Iranian retaliation that is coming. At the same time, listen, there is so much hatred and polarization against the president that there are Democrats who are going to posture and scream from the rooftops against this president, but whether they're actually prepared to take any responsibility to actually interfere with American foreign policy at such a critical and dangerous time. My entire experience with the American Congress, unfortunately, is that they're not prepared to actually carry that weight of responsibility on their shoulders for the consequences of any serious action.
Gotcha, John. Thank you so much for being with us. John Hanna,
Thank you,
tremendous word.